what is either a conspiracy or not can actually become clear, and that bridge can be crossed with data. Because it is a conspiracy until there's data. And if the data is disproved, then it's a conspiracy.
Right. Welcome to Self-Funded with Spencer, sponsored by Pareto Health, ClaimDoc, and PlanSight. Whether we're discussing innovative new healthcare strategies, exposing hidden revenue streams or misaligned incentives, or even just cheering on the next generation of this industry, we promise you that you're going to learn something. So thank you for joining us for another great conversation about the future of healthcare. Hey guys, well, let's get started. I mean, there's no reason to have a huge fanfare. Let's go ahead and kick it off. I'm going to say I'm here with Savva and Zan. I think that, and you guys can give your full names and your descriptions and things like that. But I was telling you off camera, why don't we just position this? This is going to be a big idea kind of podcast. Every once in a while, I'll feature, hey, this is a solution and it does a very simple thing. It's easy to follow. And we're just going to talk about that. This is a big idea where we're actually looking at, can we invert an incentive model? Can we change the way pharmaceutical drugs are all developed and or trialed, and can we make those incentives more aligned with the outcomes we want? So I just want to position that now. If you're a coffee drinker, you're a nootropic guy, whatever, pop one real quick, pause it, and then we'll get into the big ideas. But why don't you, real quick, each of you guys introduce yourselves, and then really quickly tell me what Public Good Pharma does in a nutshell. Savva, you go first.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Savva Kerdemelidis. I'm the founder and CEO of Public Good Pharma. We'd set this up last year, but it came from the ideas from my thesis around 10 years ago. I was looking at the issue of drug development and development of new therapies, and basically there's a lack of incentive to develop therapies where essentially it's like a public good, like a repurposing an off-patent drug or looking at diets or supplements, but essentially there's not very profitable to make these new therapies, but there's a massive medical benefit to the therapies. So there's this kind of disconnect between traditional pharma and the sort of where they just want to, create a new patentable drug, and the patent laws are basically incentivizing things. So my background, I'm an IP lawyer, and I did a biotech and bio at uni, and this is kind of a way to bring those together. And I guess
I would say really quickly, law and science, the combination of the two is a very rare combination. So when we dig back a little bit further in your background, I want to figure out why and what made you pursue each one of those. But why don't you real quick introduce yourself as well and tell me what you do here.
Definitely, yeah. So I'm Zan Lowe. Joined on about, I guess I met Savva a little under 2 years ago. Started as a colleague, became a friend, eventually co-founder, but really powerful idea. So it's pretty clear to me why I joined on when I met him.
Yeah, and you're in more of a sales capacity, correct? Or business development / sales. So that could be everything from outbound to strategic partnerships and things like that, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I started with more of a science background, did biomedical engineering for a while, but really found my secret sauce was not in the deep science itself, but right in the social and structural kind of engineering of it. Okay. And that's when I kind of realized I could spend a really long time working on a very deep niche science, or I could develop a different skill set that allowed me to bring some of that incredible science from others to market, where it actually sees the light of day and makes the impact.
Yeah, it actually gets used. And it's not just academic in nature, for sure. Right. And how did you guys get connected? Because I think it's a pretty interesting story, how you met and where the partnership formed. So whoever wants to tell it, you're welcome to tell it.
I have to tell it. It's super interesting because so I'm from North Carolina, but I was in Europe traveling around and working for a few digital health companies, kind of freelance, very deep in the industry, but I hadn't seen a game changer idea. And I'm in a public space, practically a park, and I overhear Savva's phone conversation. It's like in Paris. And this man is literally laying out a whole new incentive structure for the pharmaceutical industry. And it's creepy for me to listen in, but I listen in and I go up to him afterwards. I say, look, I want to join in on this project. This is it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you said it was actually even a podcast you were on, not just a
Luckily, it wasn't a private phone call. Luckily, he was on a podcast,
And so what was that like when he came to you and said, hey, didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I kind of did, and I have interest in what you're doing? How did you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it's going to take a village, I think the more people that are like interested in this kind of idea, like the better. But, also, we have had people involved, but the fact that, you got to find the people that are passionate about the area. So from my perspective, it was awesome. It's like super blessing. But it's also a struggle when you're trying to do something new. So you got to have the people on the team that want to be involved and want to be there. So yeah, it's
Well, you didn't start here. You were practicing law for a while, right? Or so let's go into that real quick. You studied law, studied science. You said you sort of slogged through law, but ended up working in that practice. So what gives there?
Yeah, so I think with law it was just more of the issue actually. Ironically, yeah, I was actually more into science growing up, and that at uni and stuff I did a lot better at science. But I realized, like particularly in New Zealand, there's very few places in the world actually you can make a career out of being a scientist and doing science. And then now actually, when you see a lot of the academics, they talk about how difficult it is in this sort of publish or perish thing, where basically you're stuck into kind of getting these grants, and you might be 40 before you get your first sort of NIH grant or something like that, and then you've got like 3 postdocs to take care of, and you might have 500 grand, and then you got to, over 3 years or something, you got to pay for these postdocs and things, and it's extremely specialized as well. Like you spend sort of 10 to 12 years getting a PhD and things like that. So it's big struggle. I mean, there's a few areas in the world where you could do well as a scientist, and pharma is one of them. But that's the kind of dark side, and a lot of the people that go across to pharma, it's kind of not really rewarding and things like that, because they feel like, okay, I'm just spend all this time, I'm going to make the ninth statin that's slightly better than the other statin, so I can get paid, a little bit, but the company's making billions and billions of dollars from it. So this is, I went into law. I thought,
was that more of a practical decision as a career move, almost, you thought, or what?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of me has always been interested though in law, because there's a kind of political angle, and it feels like law is kind of like the rules of the system in a way, and you're kind of reading the but I never really had an aptitude for it. I realized that it was kind of like a lot of the rules are kind of arbitrary and illogical, and particularly cases compared to like science, where things are actually kind of, there's a rational reason why people kind of made these decisions. But then as I spent more and more time doing law, I kind of really got it and realized it's actually more kind of like an art, and then sort of when you're advising someone, because you're trying to deal with human relationships, and ultimately what you're trying to do is reduce risk, and there's a lot of the compliance things that people whinge about, and they're like, well, why should I was at this festival in Texas, and they were like, well, why shouldn't I have my water bottle next to me on while I'm preparing food, and this is so arbitrary and things like that, and the health guy comes in, but then got food poisoning at another place, and I realized actually these little rules, there's a reason for them, and while the individual kind of thinks, oh, this is just like over
too bureaucratic, right?
Too bureaucratic. There's a kind of reason for them, but there is a tricky balance and things like that, and I think it's risk reduction, and sometimes you can break the rules a little bit and things like that, but ultimately there's a reason why the rules are there, and overall, even though they seem arbitrary in the microcosm, actually. In the macro, there's a reason, and I think pharma is similar to that. There's a lot of like rules and regulations and healthcare and things like that, which seem arbitrary, but actually, when you look at the big picture, it's kind of they're there for a reason. But then, if it goes overboard and you start to get very illogical outcomes and bad outcomes,
which is sort of where we are today a lot of the time. And one question I want to ask before we kind of move into Public Good Pharma and talk about what's wrong with the system now, which you set out to solve, and then how you're seeking to solve it. Why don't you talk about, because you were in a role with a company when you met Savva, that you were connecting kind of healthcare startups with investors, and you played this almost matchmaker, I think is the way you describe it. So Tell me what your job was then.
Yeah, matchmaker, and even particularly for foreign startups. So digital health or life science companies coming from outside the US I was in San Francisco, so mostly connecting them to West Coast Silicon Valley investors or tech companies, or everybody wants to get into healthcare, consumerized healthcare. But wow, like not just any digital health startups, but especially foreign ones, even the ones from in the US, it's just not obvious who actually cares about cost savings.
Yeah.
In fact, it's counterintuitive. And so seeing so many companies come through with such incredible technology and trying to sell to the wrong people or pitching it the wrong way. Right. I'm going to offer you to save money. It turns out your business model is based on making the pie larger. Yeah. And so that sense of seeing so many brilliant ideas not make it in made me realize, the system is structured counterintuitively with poor incentives in a large enough way where we need something that totally reverses the incentives of who funds what.
Was that why maybe what drew you to Savva, was that it was such a big idea?
It did, yeah.
So, all right, so let's position it again now. You gave me a nice descriptor up front, but why don't we talk about the current state of affairs, what's wrong with it, and maybe what stimulated you to figure out an alternate way to fund some of these things. So why don't you position that for us, Savva?
Yeah, well, I think, say, if we look at, say, specialty drugs and things like that, so the traditional kind of idea with pharma is that we create a new drug, it takes 10 to 15 years, it costs us like, $1 to $10 billion, whoever you're talking to. There's a lot of opacity around those kind of figures and things, but say it does cost a lot of money to make new drugs. The average new drug is like $200,000 a year when it comes to market. In the US, you've got, within 2 years of cancer diagnosis, patients are losing all of their assets, things like that. So there's a lot of issues with that. There's a lot of misaligned incentives, and again, kind of what I was saying before is there's a lot of missed opportunities. There's actually a lot of very low cost treatments, so that could be very effective for patients. So a great area is generic drug repurposing. So you've got basically what happens with the new drugs is that they're very expensive because you file a patent over the new drug. And that's the other issue as well, is that unless you can wrap a really strong patent over a new molecule, the pharma isn't interested. And they're also not interested unless they can make around $3 billion in total, say, out of selling this particular drug. So there's a big filtering mechanism very early on. And then, you might be a scientist that's come up with this amazing treatment, but it just happens to be an off-patent drug or something like that. And so nobody's interested. There's a lot of examples. There's about 3,000 or plus off-patent drugs. And essentially, just really, really difficult kind of business model around that. Now, you could reformulate those drugs and then jack the price up. And we'll talk about that maybe later with ketamine, S-ketamine. But essentially, you're leaving a lot of therapies on the table, and particularly even with nutraceuticals, diet, supplements, behavioral interventions. There's this kind of pressure and drug pressure, and from the pharma side, they're saying, it's costing us all this money to develop these drugs, and then on the other side with the payers, particularly with the self-insured employers, they're forced to basically, deal with these specialty drugs, which are basically taking up sort of 50% or more of their total pharma spend, even though they're just a tiny fraction of the actual treatments.
Well, Pareto Health is the manager of the largest employee benefits group captive in the United States. And it's also now the main sponsor of the Self-Funded with Spencer podcast. I chose to partner with Pareto Health for three main reasons. Number one, their dedication to improving the world of health benefits. Number two, their mission to reduce volatility and to make self-funding simple for mid-sized employers. And number three, the strength and scale of their program. With over 2,300 member groups and more than $1 billion of stop-loss premium under management, Pareto Health is the most robust solution of its kind in the country, period. Stay tuned for more information because I'm sure I'll be featuring them on an episode of the podcast very soon. Visit Pareto Health at paretohealth.com or follow them on LinkedIn to stay up to date on the latest news and developments. So what that protection or that protective moat around these pharmaceutical companies? So you said that $3 billion is a threshold or so where they decide whether or not to pursue a drug. How long is their typical patent for that? Let's just say they come up with a new molecule, they formulate it, they go to market, they realize there's a addressable market, it's big enough, I can make enough money. What is also the protective moat around the patent? How long of a runway do I have? And maybe even how are they even working that or gaming that system a little bit too?
Yeah, so typically, with the patent, it's actually 20 years and then you get a 5-year extension for pharma patents. But the reason is because it does take, if you're starting with what they call the clinical trial, there's a preclinical phase, which is around 5 years, and then maybe 7 to 8 to 10 years for the clinical trial phase, which is a phase 1, safety, and then there's phase 2, which you can show efficacy. That's usually sort of around a few hundred patients. And then phase 3 is like a much larger one, maybe 1,000 more patients. And this is where most of the expenditure is in these areas. And that's why with a patent, what happens is that you can basically have a monopoly over that new molecule, and then you can charge as much as you want. And they often do charge sort of like a lot more expensive than when you see the kind of brand pills, the specialty drugs, or the patentable specialty drugs versus sort of the off-patent drugs. You are looking at maybe by the time it comes to market around 10 years or so.
10 years just to bring it to market then?
10 to 15 years to bring it to market, and maybe you got 10 years, maybe 12, 15 years to actually charge as much money as you can before the patent runs out. And then what happens is that, and then that goes generic. And the idea, in theory, if things are working well, in the system, they should be able to buy it from India or from China, and basically it becomes very, very cheap. Now, what you were alluding to before is that what sometimes the pharma companies do, they do sort of game the system. So, when the patent's about to run out, they'll then come up with miraculously this new kind of slightly tweaked formulation of the drug, and then they'll repatent that. It's called Evergreening. Now, I didn't really used to think this was much of a problem, because I think, well, once the old patent comes off, you can still access the old drug. But because pharma will then basically do a lot of promotion for the new version. A great example is this kind of Nexium. There was the omeprazole and esomeprazole, sort of back in the 90s. There was this little purple pill, and they made a lot of money out of that because they got people from omeprazole to esomeprazole, and so these H blockers, and made billions and billions of dollars, but it's just a slight change. And really, now we know, doctors kind of know. Now, again, I'm not giving medical advice, but the real clinical benefit, the real clinical difference wasn't that much, but it created a lot of financial upside for the pharma company. And that's kind of happening a lot with pharma, and they call it, pharma call it product life cycle management, or product hopping, nicer euphemism, and kind of the critics call it like patent evergreening, essentially.
Well, and it's no different. That formulation you were just talking about is no different than the famous Duexis example. But Duexis is no longer available. They discontinued it, but it was a combination of, I think, ibuprofen and what is it? What's GERD? I'm thinking of the esophageal acid reflux is what so over-the-counter acid reflux medication. They combined it together, and then rather than buying those two over-the-counter drugs for $10 a month, they're charging thousands of dollars a month. And all they did was put them together in a new formulation, which is just ridiculous in and of its surface. But where did you discover this interest in pharmaceuticals in general, and how did you uncover all of these misaligned incentives? What was bringing you to this conclusion?
Originally, to be honest, it was more of a personal reason. So at the time, my fiance got very sick with Crohn's. This is around the time when I was looking at, and then I was going online, trying to look at around 2012, sort of what treatments are out there. And I realized that there was a lot of hype around certain things in the patient communities. They were saying you can use this particular diet, like, semi-vegetarian diet or low inflammation diet. And then when you look at the actual studies, they're usually like, 10 to 15 patients. And it's just not the sort of thing that would ever influence clinical practice. And I realized there's this massive disconnect in the business model whereby, you've got governments and health insurers paying billions and billions of dollars for what might be a not very effective therapy. And then there's all these potential cures even and much better treatments out there. But there's no way of valuing that kind of, the data. And the real key is, and this is kind of what I was alluding to before, is with drug development that it's actually the data was what you're paying for. You're not paying for the drug. As we all know, once it goes generic, you can make these drugs. It's like an industrial chemical. You can go to a factory in India and China and basically get these drugs. What you're paying for is the data to actually get to that point for the treatment protocol. So when you go to the doctor and they say, take this molecule this many times. And so there's this kind of disconnect, and this is kind of what I wanted to bring out, is that if we could create a business model for the data, for the protocol, then that would actually enable a lot of low-hanging fruit, a lot of treatments out there, and then potentially cures, which are currently being left on the table. And that's kind of what we're trying to get to, and we'll maybe talk a bit later, but
so let's describe the business model. So what is it? What is different about the way that you're not only wanting to help with the development perhaps of drugs, but the way that clinical trials are run and how they're funded? Tell me about that. Well, either one of you guys, or y'all can pepper in, but I'd like to hear, let's just crystallize it for everybody that's listening.
Yeah, I mean, so there, it's what I was saying before around it's a kind of about payer, what we call the payers, or the health insurers, the people that pay for the medicines, reform how they actually pay for how they fund medicine, essentially, what they pay for. And there's a bit of movement in this area around, say, the idea of value-based pricing. So this idea that, you will pay for a certain health outcome if you keep people healthier. And I think the bit that we're trying to get to is around with clinical trials. There's two aspects to the model. Originally, the easiest way to put it would be that instead of paying for a monopoly price for a drug, instead you would agree to basically pay for an outcome for the patient, and that's kind of, so this idea of pay for success, advanced market commitments. That's kind of what we originally were looking at as a business model. The problem with that is if one person pays and you're talking about like an off-patent drug or a diet, there's not really a first mover advantage. And you might have a health insurer say, well, why should I pay for this data when other people can free ride on it?
Right.
And that's, yeah. So that's where we came to this other aspect of the model, which I'm super excited to talk to people, and I hope everyone kind of understands, because it's really a way of getting unlimited funding for clinical trials. And it's extremely, when I heard about it, I basically couldn't sleep and think about it. So this was around 2000.
So was it being used elsewhere? Because you said you heard about it. So where was it being applied?
Yeah, it was actually a gentleman in Israel, Dr. Daniel Goldstein, in the cancer and oncology space. And it's this idea is called interventional pharmacoeconomics.
We'll say that again. So because you said it to me over coffee. I was like, wait a second. Yeah. So interventional pharmacoeconomics. That may be the biggest, longest phrase I've ever heard. But what is that?
So a more simple, I think, phrase would be a self-funding trial.
Okay.
So it's self-funding industry, but it's a trial that pays for itself, because essentially by doing the trial, it creates cost savings for the health insurer. So you've got to have the health insurer as a partner in this, and to basically come to the table on this. And a way to explain it, and this is, say, in oncology, it's a good example where what happens in the past with oncology is that they would try and basically do this maximum tolerated dose strategy. Essentially, we got to hit the patient with as much chemo, as much radiation, everything to try and treat this. And now this is kind of, we're turning around to another kind of area where we're actually looking to, realize, hey, maybe that's not the best idea to have a patient like completely, their body's just destroyed and they're getting all these secondary cancers and autoimmune diseases and stuff like that.
Right.
We should try maybe having the minimum effective dose.
Right.
And so the idea is that you could, pay for these trials, and this is through finding the minimum effective dose of these trials. You can maybe dose the drug at maybe 50% or even 10% of the usual on-label dose. Now, obviously, the drug manufacturer is not so interested in doing these kinds of studies.
Right.
And this idea of, interventional pharmacoeconomics was basically saying we can design a clinical trial in a way where we put, say, half the patients on a much lower dose or a lower cost therapy, and the other half kind of stay on the standard dose. And through that delta, because of the delta is so different, like we're talking $75,000, $100,000, some drugs, they're paying, almost in the rare disease space, millions of dollars. That cost difference from putting the patients on the lower cost treatment for the health insurer represents a net cost saving. So we've got literally a self-funding trial and a way of paying for clinical trials out of cost.
Yeah, so you're paying it. So I want to make sure I'm following, because I think I am, right? So take a drug that costs X, look at an alternative drug or a lower dosage of said drug, and the margin within that clinical trial is actually paying for itself, because whatever that cost savings is passed back to the funder of the study itself. And then if the outcomes are positive, you've effectively funded your own study and proved that there's a lower cost option on the other side of that. Correct? Am I following that? Did I restate that correctly?
Yeah, that's exactly.
So theoretically, you could almost have like a negative. Weren't you guys saying it was possible to
like a net negative cost?
Net negative. So how would that work? Tell me how that works.
Which is wow, because it all comes from the first thing someone may think is, well, if you can just do a trial with a lower cost option, why isn't that option available? So really all does go back to what you asked before, like what's the issue in the industry? And it's, that all of these therapies are left on the table. Good therapies are not pursued for commercial reasons.
Right.
And it's this limitation of our commercial system, IP and other things, is like, hey, we only fund a subset of our promising. So once you look at that massive, larger subset of lower cost therapies that often have even higher potential of therapeutic impact, now you've got all of these therapeutic candidates that you can have in a head-to-head trial where, that difference in procurement savings, the important part is like compared to what it would cost to keep that patient on standard of care.
Right.
So as long as you've got an insured population on that standard of care that's extremely high priced, it's not hard to find that in the US, but you take those expected costs and you say, hey, well, in our comparative trial, half the folks are going to be on this like very equivalent, maybe better and drastically
And
lower
drastically
cost
cheaper.
procurement.
And so the follow-up, so let's say the outcome of a situation like that is the lower cost alternative is equally as effective or is good enough to replace the higher cost alternative. Then how do you encourage or incentivize the individuals to continue to pursue the lower cost alternative so that you're realizing those savings in perpetuity?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is through the data. This is how we, say update formularies and things like that. Because these trials have a negative cost, essentially, by continuing to do the trials, you just keep generating data to support the lower cost therapy. So, a way of kind of, I think, making it concrete is to talk about, say, a specific drug. And I do talk about so there's a drug called ketamine. It's extremely low cost, like $2 a dose, basically.
Okay.
It's been around for, 40 years or so since Vietnam, and it's basically used to anesthetize people. But they found that if you give it at a sub-anesthetic dose, so very, very low dose, basically compared to the normal dose, it can be very effective treatment for treatment-resistant depression. It promotes neurogenesis. It's kind of like a bit of off switch on a reboot for your phone, basically, gets people to kind of snap out of...
For PTSD, I think?
It's mainly for treatment-resistant depression.
Okay.
And suicidality. And one of the awesome things about it is that it works very, very quickly within a day. Traditional antidepressants, you're taking 2 or 3 weeks and things like that. So if somebody's on the edge, they're basically ready to jump, you can pull them out, potentially get a very effective treatment. There's other treatments out there like transcranial magnetic stimulation, things like that. They're kind of the similar kind of rapid effect. But I think this is a good example because what happened was a pharma company came in, Janssen and then Johnson & Johnson bought them and created S-ketamine, which is a slightly tweaked version, and then created an intranasal version. And this is between $30,000 to $50,000 a year. It's around $800 a dose. So you're talking $2 a dose, $800 a dose.
And the S-ketamine is a slight reformulation. You said the delivery system is different with the nasal spray.
Yeah.
But what's the difference in the formulation? Can you describe it
Like the left-handed side of the
layman's term?
molecule.
Okay.
Yeah, it's right. The S and the R ketamine, like racemic is both. It's just the left.
And do they effectively do the same thing? Is it essentially the same
Effectively
outcome?
the same, slightly inferior thing on several ways for the S-ketamine for the Spravato, but I think it's an interesting example also because so you have this discovery that an existing drug, ketamine for anesthesia, dosed at lower doses, effective for mental health, for depression.
Yeah.
Then you look at okay, well, is there an incentive in our current system for somebody, for J&J or another pharma to pursue this and bring this to market for a new indication for mental health, save lives, save suicidality? Well, no, there's not, because it's generic.
Right?
Yeah, so then you got this generic available drug. There's no incentive for them to put a bunch of money into trials. So they had to. We set J&J up with this paradigm where they have to take a slightly inferior version, the left-handed side of the molecule, make a intranasal delivery. It's not quite as good. It's almost equivalent, but we pushed them kind of down that route because that's the only way they could get a new patent, charge $30 to $50K a year, make back their costs. So now instead of people getting that effective $2 a dose treatment, they're getting the on-label approved Spravato from J&J, which only came about because the patent system allows
So your goal with your model is to re-incentivize the lower cost.
PlanSight is a complete game changer in the world of insurance brokering. As a broker, you know how time-consuming and error-prone the traditional RFP process can be. But what if I told you there's a better way? PlanSight is the only end-to-end RFP solution on the market made specifically for benefits agencies. It's like having a superpower that gets you an average of 8 to 10 hours back per employer renewal per year. And the best part? PlanSight supports all carriers, all funding types, and all group sizes for over 20 different benefits. If you're ready to make your RFP process faster, more efficient, and more profitable, it's time to call PlanSight. Visit plansight.com now to book a free demo and discover the future of insurance renewals.
How do we set this trial up? Why don't we go in a concrete way? Let's describe what would happen in order to pursue this.
So say, you're a group of employers or, captive, whatever it might be, or a big employer, and you've got, 1,000 patients taking S-ketamine, and with 1,000 patients, say at $50,000 a year, and they might to keep paying, that's, $50,000, $1,050 million. So you've got a big $50 million line item. And then the idea is, we would come along, we'd say, look, we are doing a clinical trial. This is a clinical program, Interventional Pharmacoeconomics, we call it IVPE. And we would offer, they'd be optional, but we think we can get better outcomes. I think it's very important actually that we do start with the therapies that are actually better, that we're likely to get a better outcome with the patient. And with IV ketamine, basically you get 100% bioavailability instead of 54% with S-ketamine. So, and actually when you ask the clinicians, because there are a lot of ketamine clinics and things like that now, they are getting potentially better outcomes. Now, of course, we don't know, but it's off-label though. And so, it still needs a trial. We still need to be able to generate the treatment. So, we would offer the opportunity for patients if they wanted to, instead of before, say, the prior authorization process, if they wanted to enroll in this particular clinical trial where they might be randomized to receive either ketamine or S-ketamine. Okay. And then every patient that agrees to enroll in the trial, basically we would charge the health insurer, say 80% of what they would be paying for S-ketamine. So that employer, whoever it might be, the health insurer, gets those 20% cost savings guaranteed. And then out of that, we basically can pay for the clinical trial, navigate the patient into this trial. They're getting more monitoring. So it's sort of better for the patient. They're getting more active standard of care basically in a clinical trial. You might be in a very, under a PI that's basically an expert in their field as well. And so sort of like bring the right parties together, win. And then ideally, when we're very confident that the trial might show that this is equivalent or better, then essentially you've got then enough data potentially even to get through to FDA approval, and you've got ketamine approved for much lower cost drug, and then we can provide that drug at cost to those employers that originally supported that trial. And so they get sort of 99% cost savings versus before. So you sort of got 20% cost savings during the trial itself, and then sort of 90 to 90 plus.
Yeah, I would say 90+% is, but let's say that, again, let's say the conclusion is positive and the ketamine, the cheaper alternative, is the effective route. If I'm an employer that discovers this, what do I do to restructure either the formulary, or what do I put in my plan document, or do I just incentivize the lower cost alternative through waiving of copays, or how would you structure the plan to make sure that they continue to pursue the lower cost option forever as a member? Do you have an answer to that, or do you want to brainstorm it right now? We can brainstorm it.
Well, I mean, I think this formulary design thing is very much, and particularly with the pass-through PBMs, that's kind of what they're doing with this. I think it would make sense. It's just the same if you've got a generic versus the branded drug. Yeah, sure. And the same even with health care, with surgeries and things like that. Well, you can go to this hospital and get your knee surgery where they get worse health outcomes and it's $50,000, or you can go to this hospital and it's a lot cheaper and we're going to fly you out and everything. So, I think that's more on the, we just want to generate the data. And to be honest, like, when we do the trial, and let's say, we're not obviously aiming for this, but let's say the trial says, okay, these patients actually do better on Spravato. That's actually very useful data for the employer. Now we know, okay, these patients should stay on Spravato. These ones should go on the ketamine, and we're starting getting into.
Well, and it's not just the employer. This is where I think the idea of a public good comes in. So let's say the outcome of the trial shows that for that employer. Wouldn't we want the rest of the country and or the world to have access to that data, right?
And with us, yes, it's possible, because normally, right, that the trials are sponsored only by the folks who care about the drug being sold. So you think you're going to see any of the results if it's not great? It just kind of goes away if it's not great, right? You see the good results, you see the results they want. So honestly, the fact that all of our trials generate valuable data, good or bad, that's a public good. And then because of the procurement difference during the trial, they also all generate money. So all of a sudden you've got, instead of like a medically, informationally risky and financially risky trial, you've got trials that are guaranteed to have savings and revenue and good information. So we've got double guaranteed benefit.
Well, no, I love that. And then I'm just thinking, like, where all can we apply this? Like, how do you look at, well, let's ketamine or S-ketamine as the example you arrived at. Why that particular set of drugs, right? How do you pick which ones to pursue? I
love that specifically because there's such a misaligned incentive with. So let's say we've got this choice from for both the patient and the employer. So they can go in and say, like, okay, patient's got treatment-resistant depression or suicidality, and they desperately want this ketamine therapy. Well, the choice right now kind of sucks. Like, you can go in and you can be a little risky and do the off-label ketamine infusion, or you can get the only on-label treatment for the treatment-resistant depression, the one that Spravato, J&J put through. Well, for the patient, it's probably going to be cheaper to do Spravato because copay, it's covered by insurance, right? And so that actually helps that mechanism continue versus, the slightly more effective IV, original, cheaper, generic. Well, patients have to pay out of pocket for all the infusion costs and stuff like that. So you've got this mechanism where for the patient, probably go for the Spravato with the cheap copay, and then your employers are paying $30K,
Right, and
$50K.
that's the whole obfuscation of the system, right? With like, if I'm a member and I have a copay and I can pay and it's $5 for me, I don't care if it's $50,000 for my employer. I don't even know that it's $50,000.
And then this is why wages are, can't barely increase as fast as healthcare premiums. So we're all going to be it's not good.
And this is where I'm really getting at when I set up this conversation initially is what we're getting is undermining the actual structural incentives that exist today. And there's going to be a lot of resistance with very powerful players that don't want this to succeed. I mean, it's one of those things on balance, when you rationalize both, you go, well, how could anybody argue against a public good and a public benefit and a cheaper alternative for the member and the employer that lowers premiums over time? How could you argue against that? And it's, because us three might just rationally be looking at it and say, ethically, I couldn't. But there's a lot of financial and structural incentive to prevent that from ever happening. So how do you handle or plan for the headwinds that you likely might face?
Oh, this is something I think we think a lot about this. It's such a big picture. Yeah, it shakes the boat. We'll say that shortly. It shakes the boat. But honestly, I think at first, while it might seem a risk, let's say, to pharmaceutical companies that have really high cost standard of care, and we come in and we replace it with a more effective, lower cost. Yeah, that's a short-term risk for them. But in the bigger picture, this is a new mechanism to commercialize your medicine where you don't have to depend on the patent protection, and you can bring more things from your pipeline into the market because there's new sources of funding, new ways to value the treatment by the data of the protocol and
it is your IP to say, hey, we know how to set up the actual trials themselves to ensure they're randomized properly and that the data itself is going to be credible. Is that where you guys come in?
Yeah, well, it was what you alluded to before. Essentially our expertise would be finding those lower cost therapies which are very kind of medically de-risked and likely to be better than the current standard of care. Or we would partner with, pharma companies and just develop a lower cost, slightly better version of an existing drug. Now, that happens a lot with rare disease. There's a lot of price gouging going on. You've got this drug called Ravicti at $740,000 or $800,000 a year. It's actually, the formula is like off patent. It's not very, expensive to manufacture. You can create a much lower cost version of this drug. And then the delta, is so massive. Every patient that agrees to take our version, slightly say pro-drug version of this drug versus the existing one, is going to be sort of a $800,000 cost saving plus, or at least $500,000 cost saving, and that we can sort of say, look, we would charge $500,000 per patient, and then that would, you keep the $250,000 or $300,000, and then we would use that to fund the clinical trial, and you're not up against the wall with these.
Right. Well, how do you source the drug where you can guarantee the 20% cost savings up front? Are you sourcing it cheaper or overseas, or how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, the manufacturers themselves don't have to pay very high costs. They're paying the cost because, again, what we're saying, essentially, that if they're making the drug and they can make the drug and you can actually give the drug to people, if it's an FDA-approved clinical trial, it's totally okay to test these drugs. But we are looking, basically at drugs where we already know that this drug is very, very likely to work and there's not a risk. Traditional pharma, and the difference is that, they're creating the most patentable drugs, and those drugs might not necessarily be the best. It's a bit like a good example is the Gillette razor. Which version of the Gillette razor do you think went to market? It wasn't the one that maybe was the best razor. It was actually the one that had 40 or 50 patents. And same thing with these drugs, particularly Humira, all these new drugs, they've got hundreds of patents that cover them. And it's kind of, that's really what got me into this, is that if you're a scientist, it's not necessarily the best treatment that's getting to the patient, and it's actually the most patentable one, and that's a real tragedy.
It sucks
because you're not valuing, patents are completely arbitrary. To be honest,
coming from a patent lawyer here.
Well, but it's a system. I understand why it was created, but doesn't really work that well. Pharma is so reliant on a patent, And yet it's just so arbitrary. Like, I'll give you an example, and this is kind of what really got me into this space. I'm a scientist, and I, do this amazing experiment. I published this experiment showing that this particular chemical works and cures brain tumors in rats or something. Now, when brain tumors are like 90 to 99% chance, 95, 90% chance of dying, and I published that paper. If I wasn't at a really good university that was good enough and onto it enough that the technology transfer was filed a really robust patent over that molecule at the right time as well, because I've only got like 5 years. Once I publish that paper, the patent's running out. There's almost no chance of me getting any kind of funding, and that's gone. And so it's completely, basically you have to. With patents, basically the assumption is if I tell somebody something, then it's a public good. Everyone can benefit from that. But that's actually not the case in pharma. It's one of the few areas where I might tell you, okay, this works in rats, but that's sort of, we've cured cancer in rats like 1,000 times over.
Yes.
That's the tricky part.
Good for them.
As the humans. And that's the problem, and that's that gap. So we need other systems of incentives, and what I'm most excited about is just that every day you're getting examples of these kinds of things, and particularly say with generic drugs that they can treat this thing, or a nutraceutical, or even get into diets and behavioral interventions and things like that. It's really the data that's what's important, and what they call, it's appropriately named, the valley of death between academic research and getting to the patient. Getting across that is kind of what
ClaimDoc is a medical claim auditing and member advocacy company. We provide fiduciary services to employer-sponsored benefit plans and allowing them to create an environment where we ensure that the benefit plans are being charged in a fair and reasonable basis.
My business is basically people, and it become a real simple transition. We thought it was going to be far more complex. I've saved, we'll say, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I could not say enough about ClaimDoc.
So why don't we talk about, perhaps, if I'm a consultant listening to this and or an employer, identifying what's a good fit for you guys at the moment, right? At this stage in your life cycle, what you're looking to solve for. Is there a certain size segment, an employer, a certain number of lives, or a certain condition you think is a really low-hanging fruit for you? Let's talk about some more specifics there for the folks that might want to actually do business with you guys.
Yeah, we got a few candidates on the. I mean, there's as we've said, there's many. Maybe I can even give the three kind of types of new candidates and trials, and Savva can go into the few that we've got on the board already. But I mean, imagine even to this patent issue, where the patents have given us so much ability to have protection and invest in R&D. But imagine being a scientist at this pharma company, and you're looking at your pipeline, and only a tiny percent is going to make it to market because it's patent. So honestly, our model can even help pharma bring some of that out of their pipeline. It's
really
model seems scary for pharma at first, but model helps.
You think they're even potential a partner as well?
So in the three, I think some biopharm companies would fit into the third maybe category of treatments that we can bring. So you have one category of stuff that we would love to have in the system but can't make it in, which is it's like unpatentable, like natural or it's off patent, right? It's generic now, and no incentive to get a new indication for it. So stuff that's off patent or so that's kind of.
Peptides fall into that category?
It depends. Yeah, you can actually patent things, and
formulation.
One of the core issues is that it's not that the issue, like you could do a slight reformulation, patent something, take it to market. The real problem I think that we're trying to solve, and the real opportunity, is that when you do actually, like the pharma companies we're working for, when you do have this kind of new molecule and you take VC funding, they're going to go for the traditional kind of pharma strategy, which is we're going to charge as much as the market can possibly bear. And that's just, rather than like say maybe taking a low volume, high health and high volume rather low price strategy where you can make almost as much. And the problem is with the latter is that it's really only the health insurers and the payers that are kind of interested in that sort of model, and that's kind of again the incentive alignment.
So with the limitations of who sponsors clinical trials now, you're not going to be able to do the unpatentable or the generic off patent unless you do a little reformulation, like I've mentioned, and you're not going to be able to kind of these entities actually can be patented, right? So a biopharma company with a new novel entity, if they take the traditional model funding, right, from like VC, private equity, and pharma sources, that that traditional model is going to demand the ROI right up to the next highest price drug. If you're replacing Ravicti at $800K a year, you better charge $700K.
Yeah.
Right. So if you want to bring something to market at 10% of the cost, can't be taking that typical money. They have demands on their returns. So we can provide a source of funding. Our innovative funding for these trials can literally help biopharma companies that just want to bring, doesn't have to be some generic or off patent, it can bring a novel entity just if they have a commitment to affordable pricing, accessible pricing.
Yeah.
We can fund that trial and not make them charge that extractive
What does that
pricing.
commitment to affordable pricing look like? Is that set in, like, actually written out that we are committed to this and we're agreeing to this?
If they weren't, right, if they wanted to, the easier route is just to take traditional money.
Yeah.
And go ahead and charge that 10x price. So honestly, we hope to be that kind of window of opportunity for them to bring that drug to market for an accessible, affordable price. This could be any new drug if they were committed. We're an alternative source of financing.
Okay. Well, what about from an employer, though? If we were wanting to speak to employers that maybe that, I don't know what size segment is appropriate, but like what sort of data would I look at as an employer to say, oh, there's an opportunity here and I should speak to these guys?
Yeah, I mean, we would only really go to employers, and I guess part of what we would do in our IP, the core IP, is where we have quite a bit of data and where it's relatively low-hanging fruit. We've got an alternative drug, which we think is very likely to work in clinical trials. We've got it to that stage. And then, we've got the existing specialty drug. And then, basically we would offer the employer to say, look, we can do this clinical trial. Patients, if they want to enroll, they can enroll. You might want to, help them, but it's like, and then we're going to compare this lower cost version of this drug to the expensive standard of care. And I guess, that difference might be massive. Mm-hmm. And so we only charge you 80% of the cost of, say, the bigger drug or whatever it might be. It might even be 50%. And then, but what it's doing is it's unlocking, that source of funding. And then once the drug actually, you get FDA approval, you can say to the employer, we're going to give you a very, very low cost. And that can be in writing. So what we call an advanced market commitment. So we combine this IVP, the self-funding trial mechanism, to like an advanced market commitment where we say, we're going to supply you for this amount of drug at this particular price, basically the lowest price on the market. And that provides the initial first mover advantage, the cost savings, and the downstream. The real hero of the story is the patient. Yeah. But, in this particular case, though, the patient doesn't have options, and we're trying to come up with a better version. And then ultimately, the patient does suffer as well from the high price of the drugs, although a lot of the time, particularly in specialty pharma, they basically try and reduce the copay and they push it all on to the employer. With a lot of other drugs, and particularly, even esketamine, things like that, they do get like a 20% copay and things, or there are a lot of drugs where there's a very high copay for the specialty drugs, so they're also out of pocket.
But to me, the big picture component of this is if we're looking at efficacy and we're looking at cost and we're trying to find the thing that maximizes both of those, there's an aggregate good from health outcomes in the United States, from lowered overall costs as well. Yeah. Perhaps it does undermine some of these egregiously priced drugs and those no longer become viable, right? Yeah, so that short-term profitability motive is no longer there, right? And so there's this humongous potential good, right? It's just convincing people that the model works too, and finding people that are willing to maybe participate in almost buck status quo. Yeah. And a lot of reasons why they might not want to do that. But please comment on that. Yeah.
Going into that, right? Like the folks that'd be a good fit for this, right? So an employer that is paying a high price for a specialty drug or any sort of very high cost pharmaceutical standard of care, reach out, because our pipeline of lower cost replacements that are often better quality as well is growing, right? Because it could be the patent issues, or it could be that we're making new partnerships with biopharma companies that want to bring accessible pricing. So our pipeline is expanding rapidly. If you're paying a high price for your specialty pharma, reach out, because we may have a replacement on the menu coming up. Yeah. And we can offer you that trial. We'll calculate based on what you're spending and what our replacement be. We'll tell you how much you save during the trial. If the trial works, that's guaranteed.
Okay.
After the trial, we'll tell you how much you would save going further.
Okay.
Right. And the other thing, it's not just if you're spending a lot of money. If you want to be part of a new and better system, if you and your employees are aligned to participate in this new model to fund things with more aligned sources and bring better solutions to,
When you guys said it's not just Savva, you were saying too, and that's brilliant, and I agree with you, right? There's almost like a call to the hearts and minds of these employers that will do better.
Yeah.
But you said it doesn't even have to just be drugs, right? You alluded to the fact that it could be lifestyle or diet intervention. So tell me about that.
Very true.
Yeah, I mean, just so the broad categories we're thinking about now. So we talked about Spravato. You have a big Spravato spin. We're also interested in Ravicti. Immunotherapies. We've got a de-escalation pipeline for that. And then the last one is really the GLP-1s. I mean, this is the story that everyone's talking about. But, what if you could have a behavioral intervention, a dietary protocol, which people could stick to long term, and you're basically getting the same or better outcomes than a GLP-1? Or you have a protocol where, you get the initial boost, the confidence boost, say, with taking a GLP-1 for a shorter period rather than taking it for your whole life. Mm-hmm. And then you move on to this kind of behavioral protocol. So we're working with, organizations that are interested in that, basically vetting, the best in class, as it were, of these behavioral type interventions. And then, you could do basically a head-to-head study with the GLP-1. People randomize either they receive that and or, shorter duration of GLP-1 plus the behavioral intervention, or you just do the behavioral intervention and GLP-1.
Would that be like a ketogenic diet? Is when you say behavioral intervention, is that what you're referring to? Or
behavioral, nutritional, it's
any and all, right?
And I think there's this. I would say there is an understanding from many folks that this stuff works, right?
Yeah.
Behavioral and dietary stuff is super powerful.
Right.
It's medical level powerful. But what's missing is the data
to prove it.
And so we've got this kind of, I'd see like an arbitrary divide, an unfortunate divide. It's not, but it's clear. It's not arbitrary. It's clear to see what is the divide between healthcare and health and wellness. Mm-hmm. And stuff that's like nutritional and behavioral is often just put into the health and wellness, even if it has a larger than medical impact.
Yep.
So what's the deal? Why the divide between healthcare and non? Well, the data. How will you fund a study to compete with pharmaceutical level data without the profit motives? Mm-hmm. How will you fund a study for the behavioral nutritional intervention, even when you know it does better? How are you going to pay for that study to get the massive data to compete with the pharmaceutical intervention? We will fund your study. That's the answer.
Yeah. Well, that's just it. It's you could prove it, right? There's a massive amount of anecdotal information out there, and especially if you follow some of the influencers in that space. There's one I like a lot, Sean Baker. He has thousands upon thousands of anecdotal examples where people private message him resolutions of IBS or resolutions of psoriasis and things like that. Just in extreme situations too, in total remediation of those things.
So we're closer than we think with that, right?
Yeah, but we need to prove it, right?
Exactly. And the difference between like a centralized trial and all this anecdotal data, that gap is closing as well because we have decentralized trials now. So actually, all of those anecdotal stories could be part of a decentralized trial if we use that rigorous, the protocol and the tracking and the kind of the data rigor and collection. Honestly, we should all be on trials all the time. I mean, we're all doing experiments on our health ourselves.
We're just not tracking.
Why not be on trials? Why not be on, that's my new t-shirt. Why not be on a trial?
Why not be on a trial? I like it. Yeah. Well, I think then when you talk about really massive disruption, which I was going to say a moment ago, what if a drug wasn't even required altogether, right? Or what? I mean, not to say the power of what has been developed. There's some drugs that absolutely cure conditions, and you didn't want to undermine those.
Right.
There are other drugs that are simply just pumped out and prescribed like candy that have a really what seemingly net negative effect on the person that's taking them when there are dietary and lifestyle interventions that you could do instead. Then you start to question, well, why do we even need some of those drugs at all? Not that there's a lower cost alternative. Should they be taking them at all?
Right.
When we talk about David versus Goliath story is like go up against and pose that question, right?
Yes.
And so I wish you guys luck. I want to kind of land the plane as we ease into the end of the podcast, but kind of what's a moonshot idea for you? What's a big picture? If you guys are successful, what would the world look like in the next few years?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Let them know.
That's my favorite question to ask. And because I really want you to imagine if this comes to fruition like you're dreaming that it is, what would the system look like then?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the dream would be, as sort of what Zan was saying, is that, we normalize the whole idea of clinical trials. Like you go to the doctor and we've got two therapies and we're not quite sure like which one particularly works. And then, your doctor will have access to all your specific like DNA, all your biomarkers, everything. And then with that, we'd have an algorithm that basically says, we think that this treatment is likely going to be the best treatment for you. So you've got this sort of data. We're actually using this, what we're talking about before, pharmacogenomics. There's all this data around DNA and precision medicine. There's just no business model to basically actually do it, because pharma are not interested in selling less of their drug. They don't necessarily want to specialize in things like that. Yes, it's happening in certain areas, but eventually, we would say, okay, and you might be eligible to enroll in this particular clinical trial. If you wanted, we were comparing this treatment, maybe this drug, to this much lower cost treatment, which we think is actually going to be better for you. So it's essentially where we actually have personalized medicine. We have these clinical trial data. We're using AI, and being able to take all of the things around you. And ultimately, you as a patient just want to get better. Not all of us, we don't necessarily want to get the most expensive and fancy drug, particularly when we start, and the doctors are figuring out, and the patients as well, is I'm not getting very good outcomes under this drug. Maybe why should I keep taking this drug when I could do this other behavioral type intervention? I mean, keto is a huge one. So, it would be amazing, I think, personally, that the big disruption thing, if we can sort of say, because there are clinical trials out there, and there's a lot of science, say for keto, for instance, so for cancer. And there's glioblastoma, for example. So there's a brain cancer. You've got 95 to 99% chance of dying. So basically, when you go to your doctor is just saying, well, you're going to die, and that's it. And it's basically anything we can do. And we're going to treat you with all this radiation and chemo. It costs $500,000 a year. But you've got people, and there are little trials happening now, and they're getting double the overall survival from the normal. But they're very, very small trials. And some stories about people and the cancer is completely gone. And it makes sense because, we're not talking woo-woo stuff and, all this bro-science kind of thing. It's actually, there's, Warburg effect. There's this idea that your cancer cells take 10 times as much sugar as your normal cells. So when you go into ketosis, basically your body starts burning fat cells, and the ketones from the fat power your body instead of the glucose, and that starves the cancer. So these things are totally scientific. You can talk to...
We believe...
I love this stuff, and this is also where we get down the conspiratorial rabbit hole, which I love the mind, but it's also like one of those things. It's like, if that's true, right? When I actually think what you're describing has a very high likelihood of truth.
Yeah.
Wow, we're talking sugar. Now we're talking the entire structure of our diet in the United States in general might be causing most of these issues, and the diet might also be the fix of most of these issues as well. And that's a can of worms open up, right?
What I would love us to do.
I hope you're right, honestly, but please go ahead.
Exactly what you're mentioning, which is you throw in the word conspiracy, right? Yeah. It's because there is this huge divide between the belief of wellness and health and healthcare, medical. And we can help to close that divide. And what is either a conspiracy or not can actually become clear, and that bridge can be crossed with data. Because it is a conspiracy until there's data. And if the data is disproved, then it's a conspiracy. Right. Not all, Yeah,
that's a great way to put it. You're actually right.
We're bridging that gap.
Wouldn't it be great, though, if you could look at food side by side with a drug, and that we don't care if the outcome is either or, because the incentives don't incentivize us to have the drug be the better option.
And this is what I believe what we're working on, is that we believe the science is, there will always be technological improvements and scientific advancements, but there is so much effective science and technology out there right now, today, that we just need to connect those pieces, the missing pieces, and the business model, right? The financial incentive blockers in place right now is what's really keeping us from reaching this dream of personalized medicine for everyone, where you do go into the doctor and you have that personalized app with all your health information, and you can be matched into either directly onto the drugs that you actually need based on your biomarkers, or into the trial to find out your data is being collected. And this stuff is actually the reason why it's not around today is that it needs to be funded from aligned sources. So as we can fund these trials in this personalized medicine, clear the blockers for the existing science to make it to people. That's what we need.
That's a great way to end it. I usually ask for closing thoughts, but I feel like that was a really
I've got no more thoughts.
Proactive closing thoughts. So, guys, I really appreciate y'all coming down here. Here's my text again. Y'all coming down here.
Yeah.
But I appreciate you, Savva, you reaching out and letting me know you were in the States and saying, hey, we would love to come on the podcast. I'm glad it worked out. I think this is fascinating, man. I hope the audience is as fascinated as I am, because I think what you're really talking about is something massive if it works. And so I wish you nothing but success. I hope we stay in touch, and I hope I can figure out to get you connections with folks that might be able to help you move the needle as well. So again, just thank you from the bottom of my heart. I appreciate you guys.
Wow.
Yeah, thank you. And great what you're doing here, I think, and popularizing and sort of socializing all these kind of new ideas. It's a super exciting space. So, and you know, and I think people, yeah, they feel like good to be in this area. I think, you know, what you're saying before, there are good people in pharma and all these different areas, but because of the system, there's seen a misalignment, you know, it kind of wears on you. But this is a real opportunity, I think, to, you know, make people kind of, you can make profit, you can make a lot of money, but actually do the right thing as well.
Yeah, let's fix the system, man. I like it. All right, guys, I appreciate you both. Thanks.
So good. Thank you.
All right, thanks.